Hello and welcome to the Big Rethink presented by New Cities. I'm your host, Greg Lindsay. Today is September 2nd, 2020, and I'll be joined later in the show by Bianca Wylie, public technology advocate, and of course, one of the fiercest critics of Sidewalk Toronto, who will be here to join us to discuss governance, technology, and more. But first, of course, we'll begin this week with a bit of presentation on the news. As of today, basically, the number of coronavirus deaths in the world has topped 857,000, with 184,000 of those occurring in the United States. Now, one of the interesting things that's happened is we've seen, this is some data from Indeed, the various job site, showing that in the United States, at least, there appears to be a sort of sine wave function at work when it comes to urban density. Now, of course, early in the pandemic, of course, the entire discourse was around the safety of large cities. You can sort of see that blue line there. Let's see if I can get my other side here on the mirror effect. You can sort of see that blue line up there. Oh, green screen. It's basically discussing the density of large cities there. But then, of course, it spread to the, basically suburbs of large metros in the South. And now we're seeing the rural wave happening, where basically per capita infection rates in places like Mattoon, Illinois, which is well to the south of Chicago, closer to St. Louis, is seeing rates at, the counties there are seeing 300 infections per 100,000 residents. So that is sort of the interesting trend, and sort of be curious to see, how that perambulation continues. Now, of course, some of the big news in the United States, speaking as American, of course, is the ongoing violence in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where protesters continue to push back against violent police response in relation to the death by police, the killing by police of Jacob Floyd. Here, of course, is President Trump visiting the ruins in his 3-inch lifts, if you can sort of zoom in there to sort of look at the heels on his boots. This, of course, is after repeated appeals for the president not to continue and to inflame violence. The president, of course, has praised the 17-year-old who shot and killed and has been charged with murder of several protesters, continuing sort of the, as part of the GOP's ongoing campaign to blame American cities and blame their Democratic mayors for the problems there. In Portland, Oregon, where, of course, federal troops had stepped in and escalated matters with protesters, here we saw a rally of pro-Trump supporters in large pickup trucks that gathered out in the suburbs of the city, then charged into it, shooting protesters with paintballs and otherwise inciting violence, causing at least one protester to be killed as well. So the ongoing sort of discussion here about armed paramilitaries in the United States being rallied by the president, who, of course, is defending them, saying that the killings, the murders that they're committing is justified in self-defense. An ominous development, to say the least. Now, while that's happening, of course, in Los Angeles, of course, the LAPD killed Dijon Kizzee, who was a cyclist there. He, of course, was stopped by police for a supposed cycling infraction. They found a gun in his belongings that he had dropped and then shot and killed him. This touches, of course, to the heart of the discourse by many Black urbanists in the United States after the death of George Floyd, pointing out that many of the urban amenities advanced by white urbanists, such as myself, of course, I will happily include myself in this discourse here about cycling and other quality of life improvements, of course, mean little or nothing to various Black residents of cities because it creates another interaction layer for police. And so this will be sure to basically resurrect that discourse and bring it back into center attention about what does any of this mean about improving our quality of life in cities if, in fact, it basically leads to the potential deaths of more Black residents. This is, of course, advocated by Dr. Destiny Thomas and others, and we'll hopefully be hearing more from her in future episodes of The Big Rethink. Now, while that's happening, of course, is the ongoing, again, only in America discourse about whether cities are over. And so here's the New York Times contributing to this, troubling discussion here on wealthy New Yorkers going to open houses in Westchester County and Montclair, New Jersey, as evidence of some sort of vast urban flight. Of course, the real thing that's happening in the background, while all of us are paying attention to that, is that Blackstone and other large private equity funds are stepping in to buy those suburban homes before the wealthy can get there. So Blackstone, of course, which, more than a decade ago created Invitation Homes and also other hedge funds backed American Homes for Rent, is now stepping back into the game with an investment in Tricon, which is also purchasing thousands of suburban homes. And of course, what these have done is take these homes permanently off the market. And of course, we can discuss about single family home ownership as an ideal, but we have seen this sort of huge growth in the number of Americans in the last decade or so who otherwise would have owned homes and of course use it as a way to build wealth, family wealth, generational wealth, and instead are becoming, so-called six-figure renters where they have over 100,000 in household income, but are increasingly paying rent. So, the real story here is not wealthy individuals or whether everyone's moving to the suburbs. The real story is now, of course, institutional capital realizing another opportunity. Now, and of course, there's been ongoing pushback about this. Curbed published the latest salvo arguing that, in fact, that based on Zillow's own data, there is no actual flight to the suburbs. Instead, what Stuart there pointed out is his argument is that, yes, that basically there's been a constraint in suburban house supply, while an increase in demand, while there has been a marginal drop in the number of people leaving cities, which then, of course, creates these two separate phenomenon of, white hot demand for open houses and a handful of people leaving cities that are, in fact, not connected of this. Others have pointed out, there's been various images on Twitter of people trying to claim that, long lines for U-Hauls, socially distanced lines before the first of a month, the common moving day, are signs of this. The discourse continues to be nuts. And related to this, of course, is the ongoing, what's fueling the supposed suburban exit and exiles, of course, is, the end of the office. And this is the latest from KPMG arguing that what they're seeing is, their survey of CEOs, and this is a very lonely looking Canary Wharf, is that surveys of CEOs are showing that, that in fact they do plan to curtail their real estate portfolios and instead invest that money in digital retention of their employees. Now, this to me, of course, is telling because, yes, my argument since the beginning of the pandemic is that while work from home has many advantages, I did it for 15 years, is that I think when large companies and CEOs are basically trying to liquidate their headquarters, like British Petroleum is doing in the center of London, really this is about the balance sheet. It's not necessarily about whether working from home is in fact more effective in the short run. So it'll be very interesting because at least these companies are realizing that, yes, if they basically take away a means of convening their employees and a reason to actually work alongside others, they will in fact be less likely to continue working with you. Now, every, of course, trend has its counterexample, and that, of course, in this case would be Amazon. Amazon, of course, this is a picture of the largest office in its empire, 180,000 square feet, or I think maybe I have that off by a factor of 10 in Hyderabad, where it's, of course, expanding rapidly into India, is plowing 1.4 billion to new offices. And this Fast Company piece that's quoted is arguing that, yes, while many companies have found that they can retain their workers and maintain productivity, they're finding it impossible to grow during this. That there's simply too much soft cultural matters that you get from face to face. They're finding it hard to attract and retain talent and onboard them into company cultures. So it'd be interesting to see if Amazon, again, continues to be the exception here. The one thing Amazon is definitely killing, of course, is malls. Bloomberg came out with this great piece and graphics this on sort of the ongoing distress in B and lower class malls there with their rising number of vacancies. And of course, they provided this nifty graphic here showing, sort of ongoing retail bankruptcies. And I think this is interesting, of course, because yes, obviously the pandemic and obviously this tipping point has propelled that. But you can see even in 2019, this sort of rising tide of retail bankruptcies as, all that is solid melts into the air of the e-commerce layer. Now, Amazon, it's been interesting, of course, that that two major stories dropped this past week here. This is by Barry Lynn on the cover of Harper's here. Barry Lynn, of course, was the one who famously resigned from New America after receiving internal pushback from the director of the New America Foundation because he had angered Eric Schmidt, then CEO or chairman, I should say, of Google. And here, of course, Barry Lynn has been a very outspoken critic at open markets and other efforts about sort of the incredible power and governance challenges posed by the big technology stacks. So he has his cover story, and then Cory Doctorow, not to be outdone, published it on Medium on 1.0, but also coming in book format, a 109-minute read here, his epic full-length How to Destroy Surveillance Capitalism. And not to give spoilers on both his or Lynn's piece, but the argument for both of them is not to fight over personal data or other sort of measures. It's straight up antitrust. Break up the monopoly power of both organizations and the hold that they have on cities, of course. Amazon and its HQ2 sort of was a projection of its power there. We've already seen, obviously, what e-commerce and others are doing, and sort of the fact that we talked about in the last episode that Amazon and FedEx are trying to write laws allowing delivery bots on sidewalks. We can sort of see the power of the tech stacks are trying to break their way increasingly into the physical layer of reality. And we're seeing pushback on this. And the latest sort of wrinkle in this to sort of see again how these various distortions come into the real world is this piece in Evanston, Illinois here on how various Amazon drivers are figuring out that if they hang their smartphones in the trees near Amazon dispatch depots, they can get orders faster. The sort of race to the bottom, the sort of individualizing of how to game the Amazon algorithm to basically get gigs in a gig economy world. I want to bring on Bianca in just a moment here, but that obviously back in May, Sidewalk Labs, which of course is a part of the portfolio of Alphabet, had launched its Sidewalk Toronto project to build a smart city there. Bianca and others, fought for years against this effort to rally support to push back on this and the sort of the threat it posed to the various governances in Toronto. Sidewalk, of course, as it withdrew from the city in May, claiming, pandemic-related measures, also announced a new sort of subsidiary called Sidewalk Infrastructure Partners, which was backed by money from Alphabet, the parent, Sidewalk Labs, and the Ontario Teachers Pension Fund, institutional money. They laid low for a while, but now they've reappeared, spinning off a new company. This is like a Matryoshka doll, called CAVNU, which stands for Connected and Autonomous Vehicles Avenue. And this is response to an RFP by the state of Michigan to create private, autonomous, and connected lanes spanning from downtown Detroit out to Ann Arbor and back. And so you can see sort of this rendering here of like imagining what these separated highway, presumably digitally tolled lanes would be. And we can start to imagine that the future of the smart city now is no longer these gleaming all-in-one districts, but pieces of privatized infrastructure with built-in tolling and other mechanisms of this. And so we'll address that with Bianca momentarily. But first I want to plug one of her most recent projects. She worked recently with the Mindru Foundation to launch the site called Future Says, sort of examining, how to approach and think about public policy responses here to with regards to the stack. So, again, addressing some of their political end runs, thinking about how to empower workers. We've talked on the last episode about, basically the wrong kind of AI and how automation is being deployed, basically to destroy labor and wages rather than increase productivity. And then also reimagining what some of these technologies can be. And so you can sort of see here thinking about, how do we center a future of work that's human? How do we address, whether through antitrust or other measures, the so-called the lawlessness and impunity, as they put it here, and then also thinking about, are there other models of how we might deploy this technology? And this one was interesting to me because it was accompanied by a report by Anthony Townsend and Brian Boyer. You might recognize Anthony if you watch our sister webcast, Commotion Live, where we had him recently to talk about Ghost Road and talk about, other potential futures when it comes to the future of autonomous vehicles. All right, so with that, I would like to welcome out Bianca on the stage here.
Hello.
Hello. I just love the fact you just appear instantly. I'll never get old. Thank you so much for joining us, Bianca. It's a pleasure. You've been described as the Jane Jacobs of smart cities. I always have to drop that one because I would rest on those laurels forever. But I'm curious your thoughts on the Mindru project and what you're up to these days. Obviously, there was a moment in May of sort of celebration by a lot of the skeptics about Sidewalk, but even then, anybody who was paying attention knew that that some of the threats to governance and democracy posed by that project and sort of how it was doing an end run around the wishes of voters would still persist. I mean, they didn't even admit defeat. This was a voluntary withdrawal versus an actual pushback by governance. So I'm curious, as you survey the landscape, it's now almost 4 months later since that happened, and we're sort of seeing their next act, and you're seeing what else is happening in the world here. How are you choosing to devote your time, and where are the potential avenues of how we can begin to regulate these entities and where we should be devoting our time to, I guess, resisting them?
Yeah, there's a lot in there. I think that you said RFP when you were talking about Sidewalk's new project in Michigan. And I think, when the stuff in Toronto wrapped up, for me, it was relief for a while, just sort of this unwinding slowly of having to constantly sort of respond just to this force that was coming, from both government and corporate side of, ideas for the future of our city. But once that had subsided, I think I go back to this idea at the beginning of Sidewalk, and as you mentioned, an RFP. And when we talk about areas of focus, I think procurement continues to be this really gnarly space with technology, particularly. And there's a couple of things to compare between Toronto and this Michigan project. And I think the one thing that I would say from the Toronto side that is unresolved for me is how a lawyer who is a publicly funded lawyer both saw or helped write an RFP that asked a private company to define governance, because that happened. And that for me is something that has not been resolved, because I sit and think about that a lot. And I think the same about this RFP you just mentioned, where you're taking things out of the policy arena and pushing them into what I would say in both cases, you have this economic development piece that pushes the choice. And one thing that was always different to me between Toronto and say this Michigan case, in Toronto, the economy and now we're in pandemic time, so it's different, but there wasn't this need to have a project like that. No one needed it, right? Whereas in Michigan, if you're, you can hear from the state side that this is a decision, we're pursuing this technology as an economic development opportunity. We're gonna lead in automotive, you can hear that enthusiasm from the state. If you live there, you think this is now this gets back to I can't say no to this thing. This has been decided. And my consent on that direction for technology is not required. But what I think, and just to bring it back really to your point or your question, it's in a procurement. It's not a policy. You see, this is a tender. It's not a policy. And so that to me is a site that I think we all need to be looking at really frequently and consistently as an intervention space, but also to acknowledge the power there, because that's not something, that's where both parties are in, right? So how do you contest that? And if you go down that track of that RFP, you can get into, was it competitive? Was it, how did they get to the terms of what that is? Yeah. There's a lot in there. So I think in terms of a site for advocacy, we need to identify procurement as something that, because it's a place to pay attention to. It's also a place where how you intervene there can take on a few different qualities, right? But you can always push on process rather than technical. When you started to talk about those two pieces that you mentioned from Lynn and Cory Doctorow, get away from the minutia of the well, how's the data, or how is the this, or these sort of once you're down that road, you've lost the big question, which is, why is this happening? Where did this come from? Is this a policy we stand behind? And you get mired in the wrong weeds, I would say. So I think from a democratic and a participation perspective, procurement is a really good site for focus. However, I'll just end on the point, in this reflective time right now, that feels so defensive. It's all, you're mitigating, right? Like you're trying to get involved in something when there's already something happening. So how do we preempt the RFP stage? And at the same time, what we really should be thinking about, which goes to some of the Mindaru work, is what is the policy and legal and what's the framework that we need to have that is the proactive and productive one, that we don't worry when there's a tender because there's a framework in place that we're comfortable and confident about. I think that's the medium-term work.
Yep. Well, I want to delve into that, and I hope you can discuss some of your Mindaru work, because the other thing that strikes me with with the fact that, and this came up in Commotion Live, so Anthony Townsend, of course, who was a consultant at Sidewalk, and then left, and Anthony brought up it's probably to Governor Gretchen Whitmer's advantage for her to do this. You can see the political calculus for her to work, because she's inviting in technology companies, she's creating jobs, positioning as a leader, as you just said. And I start to the even larger discussion, I'm curious your thoughts, or this is an avenue for work here, is how do we convince public officials of their own, not just their own rightness or just their own mandate, but also the fact that they can be this force in the world. There's this cultural deference to technology, so it's in the broader culture, but also this ongoing, hiring of all the public policy people. I never forget the fact that Nick Clegg was the junior partner in a British government, and now he's just a Facebook executive there. And the amount of power that he must have in the UK stratosphere in particular. So I don't know, I'm curious about, do we need to create a new, what kind of institutions do we need, or what kind of schools do we need to re-educate public officials that they have this mandate and this agency to do it? They seem completely enthralled with the tech sphere on this one.
Totally. And I'd say I saw something very recently in Toronto that was confidence inspiring. There was a tender for a combination of a fintech, govtech product called Pay It. And it's a company that would enable you to pay parking tickets and other things online, but it also seeks to be sort of a intervention layer between people in the city for a range of things. It could be for programs, it could be for signing up for things that maybe public meetings. So it's one of these combo sort of companies, so it makes it a little bit hard. The reason I raise it is because City Council, it was going to go to Toronto City Council as a sole source contract. And I watched the city councillors who had read up on some of this bring up and use terms like, this is core digital infrastructure. How do we know, is this really the only company that does this? Is this? This is an important piece of what, our, local tech, this is, they basically had the language to not only push back on it, but also felt confident saying, it's fine that we're gonna do this, but let's do this well. So I need to like celebrate them for that moment, because I was sitting watching and I was just, it was a shift. And I think this is happening slowly. How we address this at a larger scale, though, I have a few thoughts on this. I think one thing is that you remember the Mark Andreessen, software is eating the world. I think software is eating the government. And I think that, no, seriously, like I really think that the way that software works is eating into governance layers. And I think there may be a narrative that we need to make clearer to governments, is that they're getting rid of themselves through automation. And there are people who think that's good, because they might think that that stops somehow in some efficiencies within the civil service. And that's a whole other conversation that we desperately need to have about what should be automated in the civil service. But the idea that governments are actually, they're handing their power over, they're ceding their power. And they may, if they want to be there in the medium and long term, like that may be something that they need to understand better. Because I think sometimes at a city level, you can kick issues forward by saying, oh, we're going to tech that, we're going to do something for, clean tech, or we're going to make transportation more efficient and avoid the big infrastructure investments. But if you also want to be there in, 5, 6, 10, 15 years, their power will be dwindling. And so I think that they need to see that the only counterforce to some of the power structure that is there is their power. And that they're not, it's the wrong play to just be seeding and think that doing it on the economic development side is the good idea. And this is not an easy argument. And I know that it's not intuitive, but all of these big infrastructure pieces, whether it's digital identity, whether it's the cloud, like a lot of this, there's so much governance tied up in there. And I don't feel good right now about the way that we've been making policy, like digital policy, or we're going to talk about technology in government, because the last decade has shown, and you can look at all of these programs they've done, whether it's at, Harvard Kennedy School or whatever they've been writing, there's different ones, right? For 10 years, the government's not responding to it. They have not responded to the opportunity to date. So what we're doing so far, to me, is not working. And hiving digital off to be a separate ministry or to have little, little programs or beta, whatever, isn't working. I think we need to go into the core of each of the ministerial or, state, like what's the transportation technology approach? What's the healthcare technology approach? And make sure that it's working across government, but refocus on tech, not on technology, on healthcare, on like, we have to go back to the content as the driver, not technology as like the front, because it's not working. And I think this is the thing, is I don't see people in our community being humble and modest enough to admit that this stuff is not working the way that it's been 10 years of open government, data this, data that. There's some learnings for sure. But I think this is it's letting governments avoid it. And I've seen people who've left the public service who were treated like, hey, we have some tech issues. And the people in the administration were like, hey, can you go fix the VCR? It's blinking, kind of like that's how important they thought it was in their world. You know what I'm saying? So you have people kind of like slowly watching this big problem happen, and they're not being given the power or afforded the authority to resolve it internally. And mostly they're not given the budget to do it. And then we're just pouring billions into legacy IT maintenance, and we can go down the management consultant, errors of, the past decades as well. All to say, I don't think what we're doing to date needs to be done more. I actually think we need a different approach with this stuff. And it needs to remind politicians and those that are civil servants that they know their stuff already. Like, you know what you need, say it in your words. Tech is small, needs to support you, and get off this thing. Because the other problem with the like anti-monopoly stuff or the break up big tech, I think it keeps giving more oxygen to that power. Instead of, and I think this is where I'm really, kind of stuck with technology, a lot of the problems with technology wouldn't be so bad if the underlying dangers weren't there. Like if people were properly housed, if people were properly supported, if there was social safety, a lot of the stuff that's bad wouldn't be that bad. It just couldn't hurt you like it can hurt you now, right? And I think like that's why giving it too much oxygen almost brings you off of the track of what you should be solving, which is definitely not technical in nature. And that's hard, just straight political, investments and things we need socially. So what do we do with that, with the things we've learned in the last 10 years, and how do we apply them to where we're going? I think there's room there, but I do think we need a narrative that reminds people that they know what they're doing and they did, and those are political choices, and doesn't make tech this, like, we can't keep making it a bigger deal. Like we need to shrink it, like it needs to be less of a force.
Well, we only have a few minutes left here. I guess my question then is, have you seen any hints, glimmers, weak signals of what that could be? I mean, speaking as an American, I think of, every time I listen to the discourse around, the willful destruction of the US Postal Service for obviously political considerations, I always am reminded of like what Singapore did, where obviously, high functioning technocracy there, but there they built their post office into a platform for logistics. The government owns, one of the strongest platforms in Singapore there. It could have been different. There, the public sector realized its own capacity and what it could provide to people there. As we mentioned earlier, there's a lot of discussion about antitrust now, and obviously plenty on the American left and probably Canadian left too would believe in some level of nationalization of some of these tech platforms. But I'm curious, at the same time, there's also, efforts in the US government. There was 18F, which was the sort of digital agency to at least help government, other parts of the American federal bureaucracy understand what they were being sold a bill of goods to from big consultancies. And some of those funders have created now US Digital Response, which is sort of like a nonprofit effort to like provide some open source tools for, mutual aid and other stuff. I don't think that's as scalable, but I'm curious. I throw these out there as other examples, and I'm curious if there's anything that gives you inspiration. What do you take any hope from? And it's okay to say that you're not taking a lot of hope.
I have to say not from a lot of that stuff, because I think it just like, so you can more efficiently get your inadequate disability check. Like, so you can more efficiently get that we need to make sure that our administrative tools help you get to the thing. But if the thing you're getting to is still terrible, you know what I'm saying here? Like, so yes, we need to do those things. This is a yes and. It's not to say don't do those things. I just think that you have to take those improvements and look at them and say, if those were perfect, if all of them were perfect, what would be resolved? And it's definitely not the big stuff yet. And so I think in the government side, I can at least say in Canada, the elephant in the room is the size and way the public service works. And from like, say, from the left, it would be like, as soon as you start to talk about challenging the way unions operate in the government, then suddenly I'm Margaret Thatcher, potentially, right? Like the minute you even go there. But I can tell you that to my mind, the public service, and I am team government, right? Through and through. But the way this whole thing is functioning at this point in time, with how, with all the ways it could work differently, is not defensible. And the amount of money that is going into the public service, when there are people who need money to just not die, we need to rethink how we're organizing even the government as a system, whether that's federal, national, provincial, municipal. And so to me, there's an elephant in the room there around how the governments operate. This even has to do with the devolution of power from federal to more municipal and money. So I do think we have a really big organizational opportunity, but you have to want to like wrangle some of that. Like that's hard. It's really, really hard, because when you get into the way that power and people are organized around technology systems in the governments, it's not good. It's not good. It is not, people are not incentivized to work across. You have legal restrictions on how you can share and operate together. And I think people have seen this for a decade, but no one touches it. They want to talk about, oh, the data needs to flow, or we need APIs, or we need to address the tech. It's not the technical. We have people and organizational issues we need to address. And I think that could open up really exciting different ways to like have government in the future, but you need to have a plan for how all of that would transition and look and function, and potentially open up legal issues. But I think that there's opportunity there. Unfortunately, I don't see leadership excited to do that, and I get why. It's not, it's a space you'd rather leave alone. But I say that because I think so many times people go into all these other pieces and they ignore this glaring thing around who are the people doing the work, what are their authorities, how are they incentivized, how could we use technology differently within government. There's a lot there. and it should prioritize, you know, that the public servants can do better work. You know, like that's a big thing to be able to help everybody that, you know, that public services are supposed to help. So I don't draw a lot of inspiration from seeing people do that generally. I'm just more like waving the flag around, like you can't keep moving these little pieces and avoid those big structural impediments, because I can't tell you how many public servants are like holding on despite that, like they know so much, but just there's a structure that doesn't enable them to like do their best work. And I think we need to say, if we're going to bother having this huge, expensive machinery of the state, who has to put the pressure on for it to work better and differently? And do we become advocates for like technology and how it's organized and the people in there? What does that advocacy look like? I think we need to think about that, because if we get too stuck on the object of the technology, I think we're missing it, and we've done it for 10 years and it's not working. So.
All right, well, one last question then for that. When you started, you know, sort of your opposition to Sidewalk Toronto, you were just one person and a sort of coalition coalesced around you. So for those who are watching this right now, what are you doing next? And who are you looking for? What kind of coalition partners that you need help with to take this on? You're not, you know, a think tanker. You're not a government person. You're a citizen who, you know, sort of built an organization around you. So what organization are you trying to build next, and how can people help?
Well, I think, thanks for this opportunity to say this. I think that one of the hardest things about telling the Sidewalk Toronto story is how many people were involved in it, and how many different ways. And I think one of the things that I reflect on a lot, talking about public money and investments, is what is the point of having this well-funded university research that sits around? Because the academics that were involved in some of the work here, like it was such a relief for me as a non-academic to find. I was like, this feels off. Oh, hello. There's 30 years of writing and research and names for all of these things that you're trying to say. And I think that's probably a place that maybe we all need to think about. How do we bridge these gaps between, like, we don't need to figure a lot of stuff out. It's written down already. We've been funding amazing research. How do we take what we know and move it into the realm of like these sort of policy and legal arenas? But also, I think what we need to do is just make and you talked about Anthony and Brian's work, make the policy space more like you want to be in there, because it's exciting and beautiful and creative. And like, how do we tell stories about futures that get us out of mitigating the existing power? And I think like that is that's the work that would be great to continue in the future, is like, let's not keep doing what we were doing before, because you can't. I think a lot of the activism stuff is also stale, and some of the people in those spaces would admit it. It's not, you know, like you need to be able to both critique and bring forward what to do. And I think we need to like weight ourselves a little more into the livening what's already been written, what to do. Like, we don't need to invent a lot. There's a lot of work that's been done by so many for so many years. So how do we like bring that forward? And I think, so there's an academic piece to that, but there's also, I think I'll end on this like note where I don't know, this is why I think it's creative. Learning about journalism taught me what I think may be one of our biggest problems right now, is that journalists had told me over and over, don't tell me what might happen, tell me what happened. So I don't know where our discourse is about what might happen. Like, where are the pages, where are the paper, is that only, like, we have art, we have movies, we have, you know, that kind of culture, but where is the mainstream discourse on the alternatives? Where does that live? Is it only in the monthlies? You know, is it in like, where does that, because it's not where we focus our attention. And how are we ever going to break out of that? We don't share something, you know, and it's too fringe and edge right now. Like, who's talking about alternative futures, and who's talking, and, you know, like, and not that there's not a lot of it. I'm just saying, where do we digest it together? How do we talk about it? Like, I've had such long conversations about what abolishing police looks like from people who only hear that one little sound clip about, well, there should be no police. And then you start to like unravel for them all the thinking behind that that's gone on for so long. They don't ever get to hear it. And I think if we're going to build, you know, more momentum, and we need to not burn out right now to keep pushing into what different futures look like, we need those spaces. And I think I just don't know where they are, you know, like, I think that thinking about where we gather more like that, and where we have safe spaces for how we share the work of teaching offended by each other as we're learning. And that's not an easy space for a lot of people to find either, because everyone's struggling, and it is a bad time for this. So I'm trying to sound optimistic about, where that work could go next. But I do want to acknowledge who's talking now, right? Like, who's talking, who's even able to show up and talk and have influence right now. And I think that's where the pandemic and procurement and stealth and power and money is like, it's fraught right now. It's fraught. But I just don't think that the standard arenas of policy and legal and all the kinds of ways the fighting have been happening over the last couple of decades are working. So I really do think, like, let's think about how we move policy and political action around, like, how our government should function into a more populous and populated space, and like draw on all the things that are known, and be more creative together. I think, like, be more open. Like, we really have to find ways to do that, because I just don't think policy briefs are cutting it right now. I really don't. And I don't think they're, they've been written. I don't think it's there. So that's it. I'm just trying to think about that stuff. I don't know. I think I always like to say, I don't know. I don't know a lot. I don't. And I'm just taking my little notebook around and trying to think about, how we should approach the next while. I think it's a bit of strategizing time too. Quiet, loud, mix it up.
Well, on that note, thank you so much, Bianca. I would say for where's the easiest place to reach you for any viewers? I would say Twitter, but.
Yeah, I think that's right.
All right. Well, all right. For those of you watching who want to find Bianca and build this coalition, you can find her. You can just search for her on Twitter. She will be out there tweeting. I know I learned a ton from her Twitter feed, to say the least. So thank you so much for joining us, Bianca.
Thanks, Greg.
All right, for those of you who are interested in this conversation, interested particularly on, how do we create those kinds of futures? In 3 weeks, we're gonna have another Toronto resident on here, Madeline Ashby, co-author of the forthcoming book, How to Future. But we'll be back before that, next week and the week after, with new episodes of The Big Rethink. So hopefully we'll see you then. Take care.